99ers have moved to disrupt two important events over the last 7 days. They crashed the Maryland Camp David G8 meeting and made some noise, but the real boom came in Chicago during the NATO summit there. Thousands of protesters braved the high temperatures and ill-tempered police to converge on the event. And they took the pain to tell NATO where to go and how. We're unstoppable, remember?
99ers are cropping up everywhere as spring rushes into summer. New York City continued their global solidarity actions during a week dedicated to another city is possible, another world is possible. OWS allied with dozens of community and union groups to highlight specific issues on specific days. May 14th concentrated on coming together to fight the mayor's budget attack on after-school and child-care programs, children's services, and education. May 15th featured Times Square crowds chanting mic checks for global solidarity. And May 16th found fun at Federal Hall with the People's Gong and a sit-in on Wall Street. It was also a week of travel as thousands of 99%ers from all over the U.S. converged on Chicago to ratchet up attention on NATO, the military arm of the 1%. The NATO Summit was announced last year, and initial plans were to hold the G8 gathering in the same venue. Those plans were changed when the Obama administration decided to move G8 to Camp David, a direct security-related result of protest action planned by various organizations nationwide. The move to Camp David managed to shift focus from the planet's 8 most powerful leaders whining, dining, and talking global economic policy. After all, plans had long been in place for major action in Chicago. There were, however, some activists present in Frederick, Maryland, to protest the elite club meeting in secret sessions to dictate quality of life for the rest of humanity. Ethiopians from all corners of the U.S. formed the largest contingent of G8 protesters. They were there to protest meetings involving Ethiopia's Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, in power since 1991, and accused of restricting freedoms, including the media. Discussions with African leaders have focused on increasing outside agricultural investments, but protesters warned against pouring outside money into Ethiopia, saying the money is used to buy and suppress the people, not for their benefit.
Displacement of a lot of people. There's a form of ethnic cleansing happening at the moment in Ogaden. Ogaden is a state which is a part of Ethiopia at the present time, but it is colonized by Ethiopia and it is being persecuted on a daily basis.
All eyes turned toward Chicago beginning May 17th as 99ers rode solidarity buses from New York and other cities across the country to meet up with fellow patriots and take a stand against NATO, a Cold War relic with an overtly aggressive military mission. NATO has killed thousands of civilians in Afghanistan, bombed Libya back into the Stone Age for yet more oil plunder, all the while ignoring repressive regimes in Bahrain, Egypt, Yemen, and other Middle Eastern countries. Member states of NATO, led by the U.S., supported the Iraq invasion and occupation, leaving that nation in ruins and its petroleum resources in Western hands. Thousands of protesters from all walks of life, not just the Occupy movement, came to Chicago to illuminate skewed priorities. Not only of a major American city spending $55 million to host NATO while imposing austerity measures like closing mental health clinics and cutting other services.
The county's cutting funds for health care, the city's cutting funds for health care, and there are certain kinds of health care, primary care, dental care, mental health care, basic eye care like glasses and that kind of thing that people need to be able to receive in their communities. Yeah. That kind of care is not accessible if people have to travel 2 hours each way to get to it. That's not accessible health care.
But of a nation pouring billions of dollars into foreign assaults, as millions of families lose their homes, long-term unemployment skyrockets, and students are crushed by a $1 trillion debt.
They say cut back, we say fight back.
They're starting to cut back on services, like how many times are we going to get to see the therapist? Instead of every week, they're cutting it down to once or twice a month. And then they're cutting down on the social worker services, on the housing services. They're cutting back on everything.
One of the first rallies was held May 18th, called by National Nurses United. Several thousand nurses and allies gathered in downtown Chicago's Daily Plaza to demand a Robin Hood tax, which would charge half of 1% for all financial transactions on Wall Street over $100 and could generate an estimated $350 billion per year.
Because they got us into this mess, they have the money to bail us out and stop the bailouts of the banks because we need the money for our communities.
Dozens of nations have already signed on to such a plan, and rally participants say it's high time for the U.S. to follow suit. Protesters marched on a sizzling hot Saturday to the home of Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, chanting healthcare, not warfare, and decrying the budget crisis which continues to impact their city.
I very much enjoy Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land." That's my favorite protest.
Nice choice. Tom, why did you decide to get involved with Occupy Wall Street?
I was very impressed with the message of Occupy Wall Street and for economic justice, and the fact that I believe that Occupy Wall Street, for the first time in my lifetime of protesting and going to demonstrations, correctly identified the villain. In that percentage of the 1% whose corporate malfeasance has caused devastation for millions of families around the world. I feel very blessed that I'm able to be the person I was meant to be as a guitar player and as an activist. Most people are not allowed to be the people they were meant to be due to crushing poverty. How many Mozarts or cancer doctors are slaving away in the maquiladoras along the Mexican border or in Indonesian sweatshops? That's one of the costs of the economic disparity that our planet has that Occupy Wall Street speaks against. And it's the fact that it's a global phenomenon is appealing to me as well. And I've been writing songs about social and economic justice my entire life, and it's a movement that dovetails well with my career.
On the streets of New York, the cabs don't stop. On the street where I live, they called the cops. Found a noose in my garage. Now how about that? So tonight I'm in the bushes with a baseball bat. 'Cause I'm a one man. I'm a one man. I'm a one-man revolution. I'm a one-man. I'm a one-man. I'm a one-man revolution.
There was also an environmental march as 99ers continued to provide an alternative vision for America, one in which $700 billion a year is not spent on defense, but on clean energy and better quality of life. Other marches were held throughout the weekend. The anti-capitalista and Haymarket marches met with an ever-present constant: massive militarized police mobilization, LRAD devices, armored vehicles, helicopters, horse trailers, prison buses, and other intimidating displays were staged everywhere. Police on horse, bikes, and foot, in riot garb, fatigued and undercover, were not content to present a menacing front. Peaceful protesters were met with brutal attacks in several locations, and citizen journalists were knocked down, harassed, cuffed, and interrogated.
Whoa, stop.
Move back. Move back.
Stop.
Move back.
I'm on a bicycle. Please stop. 1 second.
Move back.
Jesus Christ. I didn't want to fall. I'm sorry. Jesus.
Shut down.
The Pentagon.
Shut down.
The war machine.
Shut down.
All them systems.
Shut down.
Sunday began with Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans marching from Grant Park to the NATO Summit site at McCormick Place, where they ceremoniously returned their medals to NATO's generals.
My name is Christopher May. I left the Army as a conscientious objector. We were told that these medals represented, democracy, and justice, and hope and change for the world. These medals represent a failure on behalf of the leaders of NATO to accurately represent the will of their own people. It represents a failure on the leaders of NATO to do what's right by the disenfranchised people of this world. Instead of helping them, they take advantage of them, and they're making things worse. I will not be a part of that anymore. These medals don't mean anything to me, and they can have them back.
One veteran explained that he was returning his medals because he realized he had fought for corporate interests and he had come to Chicago to be with the people he thought he'd been fighting for.
I do think that for a veteran to go overseas, to have his best friends killed or his or her best friends killed, to have to take people's lives, and then to come home and to look yourself in the mirror and say, I don't think that this was worth it, I think is one of the most difficult processes that veterans can go through. And I think it's a lot easier to assimilate back to society, to come home and to feel as if that mission was justified and worthwhile. And to use the terminology, because I do think it's important that you said that, and I don't take it as in an incendiary way, the idea that veterans would be coming home from a counterinsurgency war where we're supposedly helping the Iraqi people build a better nation, and to refer to the Iraqi people or the Afghani people as hajis or camel jockeys or sand niggers is really, I think, an indication of the sort of dehumanizing training that you have to go through as a serviceman or woman in order to prepare yourself for warfare. We never really referred to the Iraqi people as people to begin with. I mean, they had always in our training been hajis or sand niggers or camel jockeys and so forth. To dehumanize the enemy in many ways is the only way you can get folks who are 18, 19 years old living 7,000 miles away to be angry and to be their emotions built up enough to want to travel 7,000 miles from home and to watch your best friends be killed and then to have to engage in the process of taking other people's lives. I think it's a very difficult thing. And I don't expect, I don't expect every veteran to come home and be opposed to the war. I mean, I really don't. I know that there are folks who had very positive, subjective realities in Iraq. So there were folks who I had served with who said, Vince, I never saw anybody get tortured. I never saw anybody get beat up. I didn't see innocent civilians shot at. We didn't do that kind of stuff. So in a subjective way, I can understand it. Objectively speaking, however, if you look at a history of U.S. foreign policy in the region, if you look at the history of U.S. foreign policy at a global scale for the last 100, 150 years, particularly since the CIA, so the last 60, 70 years, you see this continuity amongst these different military actions. And we see a lot of times that the military veterans themselves are often some of the first folks to speak up about the wars. It happened in Vietnam. One of the most powerful anti-war organizations during the Vietnam era was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who at one time encompassed over 35,000 veterans in their organization. And it's the same now. If you look at the Army Times article posted, I think back in 2008, the support for the wars amongst those in the service has been dwindling and dwindling since the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan started.
Many veterans join with their civilian counterparts to lead a protest march against obscene amounts of money spent on NATO and the military budget during a time of austerity for the 99%. Saturday and Sunday marches drew massive crowds for permitted and unpermitted actions. The unpermitted events were purposeful, since Occupy Chicago has long opposed the city's sit-down and shut-up protest ordinances, which restrict free speech and civil liberties, with several harsh requirements in direct violation of First Amendment rights. As expected, the police unleashed a wave of violence against sometimes rowdy yet peaceful protesters, using batons, bikes, and fists to beat and push. Medics reported numerous injuries, and there were several arrests. OWS has consistently illuminated several issues facing American and global communities. Socioeconomic inequality and injustice hit that list. Many observers have been looking for signs that the movement can connect the dots between trillions of dollars funneled into endless war and occupation, ongoing financial disaster, and austerity measures. The stand taken in Chicago against NATO is an encouraging indicator. showing the world American protesters realize they belong to the global 99%, that they are the most privileged of that group, and they need to redirect their government's actions. Not one of them thinks it will be easy, but each of them believes it must happen. Here's to a long, hot summer brimming with possibility.
The razzmatazz and glamour surrounding the Group of 8 Industrial Nations, or G8 summits, hides the less than savory nature of the group when it comes to world trade and security issues. Together, the 8 countries making up the G8 hold about 14% of the world population, but they represent about 60% of the gross world product, all nations being within the top 12 countries. Furthermore, the members of G8 do not do enough to help global problems such as debt, global warming, and the AIDS epidemic due to monopolies they exercise on medicine and other crucial issues. The G8 has been described as the cabinet of global minority rule, perhaps better known as the 1%. The recurring problem for the G8 is that most nations around the world are opposed to its elitist and one-sided policies that leave them with a fraction of the available world resources, and in most cases with an income of less than $2 per head a day to feed and clothe their families with. So the G8 resorts to a relic of the Cold War, NATO, to impose its rule on the world population. NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance based on the North Atlantic Treaty created in 1949, supposedly for collective defense against communism. However, following the fall of the Soviet Union, it has exclusively been used as the military arm of the 1%. NATO actions, particularly since the end of the Cold War, have had one common objective: to take over and consolidate countries with abundant natural resources or energy reserves and facilitate the rape and plunder of the wealth therein. The corporate media monopolies have used fancy words and pretexts over the years to dupe the 99% into contributing to NATO's budget and lending support to its slaughter of the innocents worldwide. But no matter how you choose to view NATO's actions, it soon becomes clear that the repeated violations of human rights in faraway lands could only be meant to enrich the 1% further and do the world populations out of what little they have left. However, things are changing. The global awakening of the 99ers is catching on, and the stern popular resistance is beginning to put the shudders up the ruling elite. Massive protests in Chicago and Maryland in the US have greeted the NATO and the G8 meetings this year. Finally, and hopefully before it's too late, folk are beginning to realize that the next major hurdle for humanity is to safeguard planet Earth against destruction by the greedy and short-sighted policies of the 1%.
Yeah, I think the Occupy movement worldwide, not just in the United States, but really it started outside of the United States, and it came here slightly late. It changed the entire conversation, certainly in this country, around class and the inherent, really intrinsic corruption and pathology of the power complexes we call nation states. So political parties can't go that far, and in this country, the United States, the limit of discussion is so narrow. We don't even have a capacity to talk about a social philosophy versus a capitalist privatization philosophy. It's hardly acceptable in political conversation. So the Occupy movement, a real people's movement, was the beginning of an uprising of people saying, this is so unfair, so unjust. The disparity between the haves and the have-nots is extraordinarily obscene, absurd. So it opened up this conversation that really probably hadn't happened in this country since maybe the Wobblies or certainly in the 30s, which was kind of the highlight of the labor movement in this country. So, but I don't know whether, of course I only was born in 41, so I only know from reading, but I know since I've been alive in 70 years, this is the first time I have felt like there's makings of an uprising that can actually lead to a collapse of the system, which is absolutely essential if we're going to survive as a species. So the Occupy movement opened up a conversation about the inherent sickness of class, and for that, I think, if nothing else happens, that has started something in people's hearts and minds that has been long overdue. So now that we see that when the system feels really threatened, like they haven't felt threatened before, they really get even nastier. Kind of like how way poor people have been treated all along, but now it's affecting a much larger percentage of what used to be the middle class. So we feel the brutality of the police who are working for the man. I mean, they're human beings, but they're in a situation where their paycheck comes from protecting the system, as they have been taught that they're doing a good job to protect order. But unfortunately, order, the system, is based on a fundamental systematic injustice. And so we have to figure out now, how are we going to deal with the system and the police that protect the system, who are human beings, who have a soul. Even though you may say they don't have a soul, they do have a soul, because everybody has a soul. So I think that as we discover the need to radically downsize and simplify our lives, we still need to be working on various strategies of obstruction and non-cooperation of business as usual. But much more importantly is that we start designing ourselves local sufficiency, local regional sufficiency. So I would urge people to become what I would call nonviolent revolutionaries, which means not just obstructing business as usual and non-cooperating, but disciplined, nonviolent. When we decide to be in the public where we know there's going to be interactions with the police, we decide to delegitimize violence, delegitimize the state which is protected by violence, by not retaliating with violence, not even to provoke the police. That is really, in my mind, very important. Do not provoke the police. We want it to be made very visible and clear where the violence comes from. It does not come from our behavior. I mean, that's important that we understand the need to discipline our behavior, so that the police are always the ones reacting simply due to our presence, even if we're sitting and refuse to stand up, but whatever, like the Davis example of the Davis students in California, when they're just sitting there and police going along, pepper spraying, the students are just like this. I mean, it's really obvious.